Hi everyone, welcome back to our Brown Bag series. I hope you've enjoyed a wonderful break over the long weekend and are ready to kick off your week with some new insights from today's Lunch and Learn session. So in view of time, we shall begin. Good afternoon and welcome to our Brown Bag series brought to you by HeadHunt in partnership with School of Economics, SMU. My name's Tammy. Broadcasting live, we have with us Ivan, who will open the session with an overview on SMU. Thereafter, we will have Professor Amanda Jakobsson, who will be presenting on the topic of COVID-19, COVID-19 and global trade flows. Before I hand over the time to Ivan, please note that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll also be conducting our feedback poll at the end of the session. So in view of time, I'll pass the time now to Ivan. Ivan, over to you, please.
Thank you, Tammy. Allow me to share my screen quickly. Right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this HeadHunt Brown Bag session today with SMU's School of Economics. My name is Ivan Lau. I am with the Singapore Management University's Postgraduate Programs Office, and I'd like to start off a little bit with a short introduction to SMU, as well as talk a little bit more about the postgraduate offerings. A premier university in Asia, the Singapore Management University is internationally recognized for its world-class research and distinguished teaching. Established in the year 2000, SMU's mission is to generate leading-edge research with global impact, as well as produce broad-based creative and entrepreneurial leaders for the knowledge-based economy. SMU comprises home to over 9,600 graduates, undergraduates, and over 2,800 postgraduate students. SMU comprises 6 schools in the following disciplines of business, accounting, economics, computing and information systems, social sciences, as well as law. SMU offers about 11 bachelor's and over 31 master's and PhD programs in the disciplinary areas associated with the 6 schools, as well as in the interdisciplinary combinations of these areas. Our master's programs are globally recognized, employ an interactive pedagogy by our renowned faculty, as you will be experiencing a little later, boasts an innovative curriculum that is current, up-to-date, and real-world. And at SMU, you will also have access to unparalleled networking and career opportunities, and all happening at a centrally located city campus nestled within the Arts and Heritage Precinct right next to the Central Business District. Now, most postgraduate programs are either broad-based in nature or providing you with the ability to work across many areas, or are deep dive in nature, usually in specific disciplines, allowing you to gain expertise in functional areas. The programs offered in SMU for the postgraduate programs that cut across many areas in terms of a broad-based offering would be our Executive MBA, our MBA program, as well as a Master of Science in Management. These are the other programs that you can see that are more deep dive in specific functional areas. I'll start a little bit on the left. We have the finance programs in applied finance, wealth management, as well as quantitative finance. That would be our finance suite of deep dive finance related postgraduate programs. Then we will have our specialized masters in communication management, human capital leadership, as well as innovation. And moving on to the other side of the spectrum, we will have a Master of Information Technology and Business that's very specialized in IT as well as business. And then we will have our accounting programs in both professional accounting and a Master of Science in Accounting in Data and Analytics. Today, you will hear a little bit more about our Master of Science in Economics and Master of Science in Financial Economics that will bring the realm of economics to your doorstep as far as your learning is concerned. And of course, our Juris Doctor as well as Master of Laws program. Another way to actually consider the programs are whether these programs are pre-experienced or where they are post-experience. And very simply put, it really means that the pre-experience programs tend to be more suited for someone who is fresh out of university or new to the working world with less than 2 years of working experience. And the post-experience programs that we have typically appeal to our students that are a little bit older and have more working experience under their belt. So these are how we would categorize the different programs we have at SMU again. Today, we're very happy to bring to you a masterclass speaker, Professor Amanda Jakobsson, who is Assistant Professor in Economics. And she'll be talking about COVID-19 and global trade wars. Trade flows, sorry. And after which, the information session will be provided by Professor Chow Hui Kwan, who's a Professor of Economics and Statistics with the School of Economics, and she's also the Deputy Dean of our programs. So without much further ado, allow me to hand the time now to Prof. Amanda, who will speak on COVID-19 and global trade flows. Prof, please.
Okay, hello everyone. Let me start by sharing my screen. Give me just 1 second. This is the usual procedure when I start my classes. They've been when they were online. Let's see. All right, so now you should all be seeing my screen. All right, thank you very much for joining us here today. So today I'm going to talk about, well, COVID-19 and global trade flows. So what I want to do today is to sort of give you a flavor of what kind of experience you would have if you would be taking my course. Okay, so I teach a course called International Trade Theory and Policy within the Masters the Master of Science in Economics. So a little bit about me. I do research in international trade, obviously, and I'm particularly interested in multinational firms. So we'll talk a little bit about so-called global value chains today as well. So if you have any questions, we'll have some time at the end to go through your questions. But if there's anything you want, any clarification throughout the class, please feel free to interrupt me. I should say that if this was a regular class, I would be expecting the class to interrupt me all along from the beginning to the end. All right, that might be difficult now. You know, this is the first time you sort of, for many of you, might be the first time you see this topic. But hopefully we can have some discussion at the end. So just to sort of set the stage before we begin, I think it's important to think about what you can expect from a class in the master's program, right? So when you start the master's program, of course, you're going to see that, you know, some courses are much more technical and some courses are much more focused on policy analysis, right? So it depends, you know, we have a set of courses that everyone takes, but then there's also, based on your interest, you choose your different courses. And my colleague, Prof. Kwan, is going to tell you more about that later. So what I want to do in today's masterclass is to give you a little bit of flavor of both. We're not going to do anything super technical, and we're not going to go into the depth of policy analysis, but I want to give you a flavor of both. And also, it's important to keep in mind that some courses that you will take in the program do not require any previous knowledge of economics. Actually, the course that I teach, International Trade Theory and Policy, it doesn't have any prerequisites. So I would have students in the class who are, you know, in their first term and they haven't taken other courses of economics before, and then there are students who have taken some economics before, right? So it's a mix. But then you have other courses that at the start of those courses you are expected to have taken, for example, microeconomics and or macroeconomics, statistics, etc. And what's important, I think, to keep in mind is that every instructor has his or her own teaching style, right? So some prefer to have very little information on the slides, just have some pictures and then talk about the material and then have students take a lot of notes. Other instructors prefer to have all the information in the slides, walk you through the key points, right? And also the same thing in terms of interaction between the teacher and the class. It will be different depending on the instructor. But I think what we can say about all the courses, and I think I can speak for all my colleagues teaching in the program, is to say that I think you should always expect from each class, not just from each course, but I think actually from each class, you should expect to learn something new. Some new tools, some new ways to analyze a particular topic. And you should also understand why these models, these tools, these techniques, these analyses, why they matter, why are they useful, right? So I think these are things you should be expecting from every class that you take. So let's start talking about international trade, right? That's the topic of today. So the topic of today is global trade, right? So we're thinking about global trade flows, and we talk a lot about global value chains. I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the trade that we see globally is actually regional trade. So for example, if you see in within Europe here, right, you see that the within Europe trade is much larger than the trade between Europe and Asia, for example, right? So we often have this idea that China is the factory of the world, which is partly true, but actually a lot of the value of international trade is happening within regions, right? Within Europe, within Asia, within North America, okay? So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And of course, behind this picture, we could spend the whole day today just talking about this picture. Of course, behind this picture, there's a lot of structures sort of hidden behind this, right? So we can think about which goods are being traded, right? We see the trade between Middle East and the rest of the world, right? A lot of that is, of course, the exports of oil, for example. And then you have the trade within Europe, right? A lot of that is also, there's a lot of production being done in Eastern Europe that is then shipped to the rest of Europe, okay? And there's a lot of, as we'll talk about later today, there's a lot of fragmentation of production of different goods, okay? So there's a lot of things going on behind this picture. So now let's think about COVID, all right? Let's think about the pandemic. So, there was a trade collapse with the pandemic, right? So in 2020, when the pandemic hit, world merchandise trade declined by 7.4%. Okay, and this was the biggest annual decline since 2009, when it was the Great Recession. But interestingly, back in 2009, the collapse of trade was much larger, right? Trade fell by 22%. It's a much bigger fall. And global merchandise trade recovered very fast, right? And this is, I think, quite surprising. And already by the end of 2020, global merchandise trade, so this is the trade in goods, it exceeded its pre-crisis level, okay? And then it has continued to grow, but of course, at a slower rate during 2021, all right? Instead, we see something a little bit differently happening in the services trade, right? So in terms of the global services trade, the decline was much stronger, right? So in 2020 compared to 2019, there was a contraction of 20%. So this is much larger. And this is the biggest decline in services trade since the beginning of its recording, right? So comparing with the 2009 financial crisis, global trade in services fell only by 9.5% then. Right, so I think this is important to keep in mind. Global services trade also, not only was the drop bigger, but also the recovery was slower, right? Or there was also more to recover, right? So the global services trade only reached the pre-pandemic levels at the end of 2021, right? So a couple of months ago. There's a lot of research about how COVID-19 interacts with the country's economy, okay? I think that's a very different question from what we're going to ask today. Today, we're going to talk about how did COVID-19 and does COVID-19, how has it affected global trade, right? So when we talk about international trade, we have to think about things a little bit differently, as you'll see shortly. So first of all, I just want to clarify that dealing with risks and shocks. So when we talk about shocks in economics, we talk about positive shocks and negative shocks, right? So it's not the kind of shocks that we usually think about in real life, right? So economic shocks are different. So this is not something new, right? Firms constantly take risks, firms are engaging in international trade and they're engaging in global value chains. And the more integrated they are in global value chains and the more integrated they are in international trade, the more potentially exposed are these firms to risks that are transmitted across sectors and across countries. Okay, so let's be a little bit more specific. What are these kinds of risks and shocks that we can imagine? Okay, so there's the supply side risks. You can have a factory that catches fire, right? The production is ruined in that particular factory. There can be natural disasters that halts production. There can be financial risks, right? You can have a supplier that goes bankrupt. There can be political instability in the country where you have located your production, your firm's production of a particular component. There can be cyber attacks, quality issues, other kinds of delivery failures. Okay, and on the demand side, we have product reputation, right? There's the competition aspect. And then, there could be different kinds of government policies in countries where you have your, where you're buying goods from that are, in different ways restricting market access, or, in the countries, in your own country, right? There could be also these kinds of restrictions on terms of what you can import. Different kinds of macroeconomic crises that are going to affect economic demand. There's also the issue of exchange rate volatility that is going to affect demand as well. And then we got shocks to the transportation side. Right, so here there are, the obvious that we've been experiencing in the past couple of months, right? The oil price, when the oil price goes up by a lot, that makes transportation a lot more costly. And they can also be different kinds of weather shocks, right? And these are of course, by nature, local and regional. So I want to sort of start from here when we think about COVID-19. Okay, so I have here a quote from Beata Javorčić, who is the chief economist at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So she wrote in the Financial Times at the very early period in the pandemic. So this is in the beginning of April 2020, where she's describing the shock that hit Wuhan, the shock that hit the Hubei province. Okay, so this is not really at the point yet where the global pandemic had become a global pandemic. Okay, so Hubei, as she's describing here, is a high-tech manufacturing hub. There's lots of Chinese firms, but also lots of foreign firms there, and they're highly integrated into car industry, electronics industry, pharmaceutical industries. And actually, Hubei accounts for 4.5% of Chinese GDP. And importantly for our topic today, 300 of the world's top 500 companies have facilities in Wuhan. Right? That's quite daunting when you think of it. So when there was the initial outbreak in Wuhan, the lockdown, Wuhan and the Hubei province, that was a massive disruption to supply chains globally. Right? And this happened even before the pandemic became a pandemic. Okay. And I highlighted here myself in blue what I think is sort of the key point here, and that's something that we're going to tie back to in the end of today, is that companies constantly, right, look for the most cost-effective suppliers. And that means that many companies were left without a plan B, without a backup plan when the pandemic hit Wuhan. Okay, and I think here, already we're sort of thinking about what is the major change to international trade coming out of the pandemic, right? It's this plan B, right? Firms are starting to think more about this plan B, okay? So again, right? Risks and shocks are nothing new, right? So we saw the initial shock to Hubei, and then that had, very quick global impacts, right? So we saw that Hyundai halted all the production in Korea already in the beginning of February. They had no components coming out of China. Well, no, they had a shortage of components, I should say, to be exact. So they halted production on February 7th, 2020. A few weeks later, Ford stopped its production of cars, both in Europe and North America. And Volkswagen did the same around the same time, okay? And now, interestingly, in the past few weeks, I should say, past few months, in March and April, we're seeing new lockdowns in China, right? So now we're having a similar shock to the economy again. Right, so recently we've seen Foxconn factories have been closed in Shenzhen and Kunshan. So this is Foxconn, as most of you probably know, is a huge supplier to Apple, for example. And there's also congestion in the Shanghai port. And why does this matter so much? Well, Shanghai is the largest port in the world when we measure in terms of cargo lifted. Okay, so congestion in the Shanghai port is a massive impact on global trade flows. Okay, so what I want to say here is that the initial shock that came from the from COVID-19 hitting Wuhan, and the similar kind of shocks that we're seeing now in China, this generates this kind of contagion flowing through global value chains, and it's not completely unfamiliar to economists, right? This is something that we've seen with natural disasters before. Right? For example, in 2011, there was the earthquake and tsunami in Tohoku in Japan, which destroyed the important factories, right, in that region. And that had direct global implications through these global value chains. And similar things happened in the same year when there were floods in Thailand, destroying factories. Okay. So what I want to keep in mind, though, is that we have to think about what makes the COVID pandemic unique, right? Because I said, the initial shock of COVID was familiar to us as economists. The latest lockdowns in China, also familiar to us. But the COVID pandemic itself is unique. Okay, and what makes it unique? Well, it is the biggest production disruption in recent world history, right? So there were production disruptions, not just in individual countries. They were production disruptions everywhere, and they were also these contagions, right? They were shocks that initiated in many different countries as they were hit by the pandemic and had to do lockdowns. And also, another major reason that the COVID pandemic is unique is that it wasn't an economic shock, right? The great trade collapse of 2008, 2009, that was an economic shock, right? It was a macroeconomic shock. Instead, here we had a non-economic shock. So we have to think of it differently. And also, we've seen non-economic shocks before, like, for example, the earthquake, tsunami, these floods, these natural disasters. But those are usually regional or national or local shocks, right? Instead, differently from any other non-economic shock that the world had experienced before, this was a global shock. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So what we're going to talk about today is thinking about how the pandemic affect global trade flows, right? And I think it's important to differentiate here between the short-term effects and the medium and long-term effects, right? The short-term effects are quite obvious. There's the direct health impact, and then these associated behavioral changes in the affected countries, right? And then there were the consequences not only of the actual pandemic, but the consequences of the actions that governments take to prevent the spread of the virus, right? So there were lockdowns, there were quarantines, travel restrictions, all these different health mitigation measures. And then we also saw a lot of import and export, both facilitations and restrictions, right? Depending on the country and depending on the industry. And then there were lots of domestic support packages and subsidies, right? And all these things matter for international trade, okay? And then, as we'll talk about a bit more in detail shortly, we cannot just think about the effect of, when the pandemic hit Singapore, how did it affect Singapore? Right? What also matters is, of course, when the pandemic hit all these other countries around the world, how does that affect Singapore? Right? That's important to think about, these third country effects. And then we get to the medium and long-term effects. Right? So here, of course, the verdict is still out, sort of what's going to happen in the future, but we can see some clear tendencies. Right? There's important differences in the labor market, right? Especially in the US. We've seen that people are not willing to supply labor in the same way as they were before. And we also see behavioral changes in demand, right? These are psychological factors. And then what we're going to focus on more today, we also, need to think about the organization of supply chains and global value chains, because there is, for many countries, there's been a, sort of twist in terms of the path towards more nationalistic tendencies, right? And this is something we saw even before the pandemic, right? That's why we have the US-China trade war, because we saw the US turning inwards and not wanting to be part of international trade the same way as before, right? So this is the tendency that we've seen before, but now when the risks of the pandemic, the risk of contagion in terms of international trade became more apparent, of course, then there's been a stronger push for what we call decoupling from global value chains, right? So renationalizing global value chains. And then there's also the alternative path, which would be to diversify the risk, okay? So this is something that we're going to talk more about today. So I think what we have to keep in mind is that what matters for different countries here is, first of all, what was the pre-pandemic structure of international trade for that country? Because that matters for how that country was exposed to shocks. And also in terms of global value chains, right? Not only how integrated was the country or is the country in global value chains, but also does the country produce upstream components or downstream products, right? What is the import and export basket compositions for different countries? All these things start to matter a lot, right? So I hope we're going to put a little bit more structure on how to think about these effects today. So we're going to start today by talking about the gravity equation, right? So we're going to talk about different models that use this gravity equation, which is very famous in international trade. We're going to talk about the role of regional trade agreements, and we're going to talk about a paper that sort of takes into account very explicitly what happens in the rest of the world. There's also actually within this literature, I just wanted to mention that there is a lot of papers here that they're doing structure analysis, right? So they build a model with quite strong assumptions on the behavior of firms, the behavior of consumers. And I think there's been, sort of interesting models that have come out of this that merge international trade with epidemiological models. All right. And there was quite a few of these papers coming out in the beginning of the pandemic or being developed in the beginning of pandemic. I should mention that from my own personal view here is that as the sort of virus mutated, these models became less insightful, right? Because with the new variants, we saw that it was the epidemiological models, you have to have a very stylized epidemiological model when you put it into a trade model. And that becomes difficult to do when you have a virus that behaves unpredictably, right? You don't know with the next, the next variant, we don't know how contagious it is. We don't know how deadly it is, right? So these things, those models, I think were a very good initiative, but in my personal opinion, I think they're less insightful. So that's why I'm not talking about them so much, or not talking about them here today. Then, of course, we're going to talk about global value chains. We're going to look at, within our course, how do we model global value chains? Just a very simple model of offshoring. And then we're going to talk about some interesting work on renationalization of global value chains, looking at the impact of that. And then we're going to conclude by thinking about what's the way ahead. So first of all, I mentioned before that the effect of the pandemic on a country's economy is quite obvious, but the effect of the pandemic on a country's import demand, on its international trade, is not obvious. So I just want to clarify that first. So we talk about import demand and export supply. Okay, so import demand, a country's import demand, so let's say Singapore's import demand for a particular product, right? Let's say widgets, okay? Singapore's import demand of widgets is Singapore's demand for widgets minus the supply within Singapore, so Singapore's own supply, own production of widgets, right? If Singapore's demand is larger than Singapore's supply of widgets, how do we satisfy that excess demand? Well, we import from abroad, okay? And the same way, if we're looking at a project that Singapore exports, let's say gadgets, okay, then the domestic supply would be larger than the domestic demand. So the excess supply is what we put on the export market, right? What we put on the world market, what we export, all right? So here we had with the COVID-19, when it hit or throughout the pandemic, we have both a negative demand shock and a negative supply shock. So the impact on a country's import demand is actually a priori ambiguous. Okay, so you have a negative supply shock. That's the, first of all, the health shock. You would have a decrease in labor supply, decrease in the domestic supply of goods. Then you got the government lockdown measures. And this also is direct negative impact on the domestic supply. So all else equal, a negative supply shock translates to an increase in demand for imports. All right, but then at the same time, we have a negative demand shock. Workers are laid off, consumers then postpone consumption, firms suspend investment, right, in uncertain times. That is the usual behavior of consumers and firms. And also, I mean, if you lose your job, you're not going to be consuming as much. So this would reduce the demand for imports. Okay, so this is just to say that the effect on the import demand is ambiguous. And the same thing happens when we think about the third countries, right? So if you would have supply side restrictions, like closure of ports, closure of airports, that would make it harder to import from, for example, the US. Well, in that case, countries are going to demand more imports from other countries than the US, right? So it's not obvious what is going to happen to international trade in general, all right? But of course, we've seen the data, we know that international trade fell, all right? So this brings us now to thinking about the gravity equation. So now we start with the sort of class part of today's masterclass. So I always talk about gravity in one of the first classes. So gravity in international trade, it goes back to Tinbergen, who many decades ago observed this empirically successful relationship. So what was this empirically successful relationship? Well, it said that the exports from one country to another, country I to country J, well, that depends on the economic size. That's the gross domestic product or the national income of the country I, the exporter, and the national income or the GDP of country J, the exporter, and the distance between the two. Right? So the bigger the economies were, the more they would trade with each other. The closer in terms of distance the economies were, the more they would trade with each other. And this proved very successful in terms of looking at the data, but there were no theoretical underpinnings at the time. So the gravity equation was sort of dismissed in research. But then in 1990s, luckily, the gravity equation had a revival. And then in the 2000s, there was lots of work on actually building the economic models that will lead to this gravity relationship. Right? So different economics models have been developed by these authors that I just mentioned a few here that provide what we call micro foundations, right, for the gravity equation. Right? So each of these papers build an economic model that then justifies this behavior that, or this pattern that we see in the data, which is that large countries trade a lot more with each other, and countries that are close to each other trade a lot more with each other. And today, gravity is a central component of trade theories, and we're going to see some examples of that today. So where does the gravity equation come from? Well, it comes from, as you hear from the name, obviously, it comes from Newton's law for the gravitational force between two objects, right? So if you think about the sun and the planets, right? So the planets are orbiting around the sun, and the gravitational pull between the sun and the planet, well, it depends on, the sun is the same size, right? But it depends on the size of the planet. So the bigger the planet, the stronger is the gravitational pull between the sun and the planet. And it depends on the distance between the sun and the planet, all right? So here we have exactly the same idea, all right? So there's this general gravity relationship that says that, well, we look at the characteristics of the exporter, the characteristics of the importer, and then we look at the so-called accessibility, all right, between the two countries. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what we have in mind here. So just to sort of bring this back to something intuitive, all right? Why does the gravity model work so well, right? How can something so simple predict actual trade flow so well? Well, it's because distance and the size of the economy, right, translates to very simple economic relationships, right? A large country, so we're not talking about large in terms of distance, we're talking about large in terms of economic size, right? The GDP of a country. A large country produce more, and the large country earn more income from what they produce, so that's why they demand more. That's why we see large countries trading more. At the same time, distance determine transport costs. Obviously, you want to ship something from Singapore to Malaysia, that's a very short distance. You want to ship something from Singapore to the US, that's a long distance, right? So you have to pay the transport cost. So the longer the distance, the longer the transport cost, the larger the transport cost. But distance also measures other aspects, right? So there's some aspect of trade cost that is not just about the transport, it's also about the personal contact, the ease of communication between the buyer and the seller. All right. And of course, distance and size explains a lot, but in the gravity models that we see, we also control for other factors, right? Because we want to fit the gravity model to the data on trade flows more exactly. So for example, if two countries have a common language, we expect them to trade more. All right. So if you look at two country pairs on the same distance, the same economic size, but one pair has a common language, the country pair with a common language is going to trade a lot more because it's easier for them to write contracts, for example. All right. Colonial link matters a lot. That's because of institutions, right? Usually countries that share the same colonial heritage has the same kind of institutions. If two countries are a member of the same free trade agreement, as we'll see later, that makes them trade a lot more. Right? And then there's things we have to take into account, like geographical barriers. We have to take into account if two countries are within the EU, right? Because that's a single market. So they trade a lot more within EU than between country pairs of similar distance and similar size. All right. So we're not going to go through this in detail today, but just wanted to show you a quick example of these so-called micro foundations for the gravity model. So Anderson and Van Winkle made a huge contribution to this literature when they introduced the concept of multilateral trade resistance. All right, so it's intuitively a quite simple concept, as I'll get to shortly. But importantly here, you know, when we would do this in a class, we would think more about where does this result come from, right? Where does this multilateral resistance come from? Well, they have a model, which is a so-called Armington model. Each good is produced by a country, right? So we have the Australian good, we have the Singaporean good, we have the Malaysian good. And then as consumers, right, there's elasticity of substitution. Right? How do we compare the Australian good to the Singaporean good? Right? How do they substitute for each other? And that's measured by the elasticity of substitution, which we assume to be constant across all these different countries. Okay. And then we have this simple gravity relationship, which is that, well, size, the country's size matter, and the distance between the two countries matter. But what actually matters is the size of the countries relative to world GDP, right? So the relative size of the countries. And also, when it comes to the trade cost, right, in terms of the distance between the countries, what matters is not the absolute distance, but the distance, right, relative to, or I should say the trade cost relative to all these other countries in the world, right? So let's think a little bit more about what this means. So we have the outward multilateral resistance term. That's the exporters multilateral resistance term. And then we have the inward one, which is the importers multilateral resistance term. These are actually just the price indexes, okay? But why does it matter? Well, each country's multilateral resistance term is a function of all the bilateral trade barriers, right? So all the trade costs that they have with all the different countries in the world and all the different income shares of those countries in the world, all right? So let's be a little bit more intuitive about this. So what matters here is let's think about a country like New Zealand, all right? New Zealand is far away from everywhere. So if you look at if you want to try to predict, let's say, the trade flow between Singapore and New Zealand, well, you look at the distance between Singapore and New Zealand, you see that distance is very large, right? New Zealand is far away from Singapore. But the point here is that we cannot just take into account the absolute distance between New Zealand and Singapore. We need to take into account that New Zealand is far away from everywhere, right? So in relative terms, Singapore is relatively close to New Zealand, right? They have to trade with some countries, they have to trade with the rest of the world, and they have to overcome that large trade cost anyway. So compared to the trade cost between, let's say, New Zealand and Sweden, right? The trade cost between New Zealand and Singapore is relatively small, okay? And you would have the same idea if you think about a country like Belgium, all right? So if you look at the absolute distance between Belgium and Norway, right, they're actually not that far apart, those two countries, right? So if we just took into account the absolute distance between Belgium and Norway, we would expect Belgium and Norway to trade a lot with each other, okay? But what we need to take into account is that just around Belgium, you have much closer distance. You have these large economies. You have France, you have Germany, you have the Netherlands, right? These are economies that are just neighboring Belgium, and those are large economies, right? So Belgium is going to trade a lot more with those countries than what they do with Norway, right? So we need to take into account the relative attractiveness of a particular market, right? New Zealand is far away from everywhere, but relatively close to Australia, relatively close to Singapore. Belgium is, in absolute terms, close to Norway, but in relative terms, right, they're much closer in terms of distance and in terms of, economic size attractiveness to all these other large economies nearby, right? So this is something that is very important when we think about the gravity relationship. And interestingly, there is a paper by Liu, Ornelas, and Shiu that translate this concept of multilateral resistance, the original concept of multilateral resistance in gravity equations of just looking at trade patterns. And they say, let's think about this, how it relates to COVID-19. Right? So what they do, and we're not going to go through all the details of this paper, but essentially they build a model of international trade, and they're comparing the changes in international trade, right? So they're looking at the pre-pandemic levels, and then they're looking at the changes during the pandemic, changes in international trade for different countries. And they say, let's look at the how affected countries are by COVID-19, right? When were they hit? How badly were they hit, right? How much contagion was there inside that country? And also in terms of the stringency of the lockdown policies, the stringency of the containment policies, how were those, how strict were those policies, right? But what they said is that we cannot just look at the absolute, in absolute terms, how affected countries were by COVID. We cannot look at, in absolute terms, how strict their lockdowns were. We need to think about it also by how did the rest of the world handle the pandemic? How hard was the rest of the world hit by the pandemic? All right. So what they say is that a country's imports are not just affected by COVID-19 at home and COVID-19 in the country it imports from, but a country's import is also going to be, a country's import from a particular country is also going to be affected by how the rest of the world handles the pandemic, right? Exactly for these reasons that we started off by talking about, that we start importing, there's imports are more difficult to get in from the US, well, then we're going to start importing more from other countries, right? And the other way around. So what they find is that a country's own COVID-19 deaths and lockdown significantly reduced imports from China, right? So they look at this in the very early stage, okay? And they find that what matters also is what we call the work from home share, right? We have to think about, when we think about international trade, when we think about global trade flows, we need to think about what was the effect of the different products, right? The work from home share matters, how much of production of a particular good can be done from working from home, and what is the contract intensity. All right. So this matters because, well, if you have weak contract intensity, well, then you can sort of, we would see firms not fulfilling their orders. But instead, if there's if contract intensity really matters, if you have an input that is very specialized to your particular production, okay, to your particular production chain, well, then it will be a different issue if you try to break sort of that contract. All right. And also what they find is interesting that it wasn't as if trade was just destroyed, right? Instead, we will see trade being postponed, right? You will not be importing as much in the next few months, but then trade will pick up quite quickly. All right. So I just wanted to highlight here the kind of data that they use has been used in many, many different papers. All right. So they use different kinds of this, famous work from home shares, the sectoral work from home intensity measures, contract intensity, how much, like which goods are the medical goods, right? The government response tracker, right? These are publicly available data that are available to anyone interested in looking closer at this. And other papers have used gravity equations and studied the pandemic, right? So they've been looking at COVID deaths, lockdown stringency, and they sort of all point in the same direction, right? So that the customization matter, okay? And also, actually, in terms of the magnitude, what papers have found is that the containment policies had a bigger effect on trade, on most product categories, than the actual impact of COVID itself. All right. So, of course, whether or not that's, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying that it's important to keep in mind that the impact on trade came, in terms of magnitude, the big effect came from the containment policies. All right. And there's also other kinds of, details you can go into here. There's some French research that has shown that the large firms were driving the bulk of the effect of COVID and international trade in France, for example. All right. Then interesting, there's other work that has been using also gravity equations, looking at what's the effect of regional trade agreements, right? So regional trade agreements, they promote trade and they actually make cushion against shocks. So why would they cushion against shocks? Well, there's lower transaction costs if you have a supplier within your regional trade agreement. There's better contract enforcement. So, when you see supply being disrupted, first they're going to be more selective about which contract they're going to fulfill, which one they're going to forfeit, and then the regional trade agreement might matter, right? And also, of course, regional trade agreement is a sort of indicative of the ties between countries. Okay. So there's a quite interesting paper here from Untitled. So this is a policy paper where they're doing standard gravity analysis, looking at the trade flows between countries and seeing how does regional trade agreements matter. All right. So what they find is that regional trade agreements, right, that mattered. Right. So when you had countries that had no regional trade agreement, we saw international trade dropping more. Okay. And also, there's an important difference here between how deep the regional trade agreement is, right? So this is something we would talk more about in a class, thinking about what are the different things that go into a regional trade agreement. Is it just about reducing tariffs, or is it about things like intellectual property rights, product standards, those kinds of things, right? That's what we mean by deep regional trade agreements. So now let's sort of start to wrap up by thinking about global production. All right. So international trade flows today, the bulk of international trade flows today is actually through global value chains. Okay. So somewhere between 2/3 and half of global trade is coming from global value chains, right? And this is, I like to give the example of the Boeing 787, right? All the different parts that are coming from all these different companies, right? So all these different companies are located around the world, and then the Boeing is then assembled in the US, okay? So why does global value chains matter for shocks when we think about shocks to international trade? Well, you have shocks to the source. Okay, this would hurt home exports that would rely on imported inputs, right? So if there's a shock in the country you're importing from, that's going to hurt countries where they're importing a lot of inputs, all right? You got the shock to the home country. Well, that's going to shock your home exports, but you can then import more, all right? And then there's a shock to the destination country that's going to hurt your home exports because, you know, there's going to be less demand for what you're producing and selling to them, all right? And this is very different, right? When we think about the plain sort of supply and demand relationship on a, you know, particular goods, right? Here we really need to think about how, you know, a shock in the source country is going to then, you know, spread through the production chain, right? Same thing, how does a shock in the destination country spread through the production chain, okay? And when we think about, you know, global value chains, right? They're by nature extremely complicated, extremely complex. Okay, so what we do in our class is that we need to sort of get the basic idea. All right, so that's why you know, we do in the class that I teach, we talk about a very simple you know, simple model of offshoring. Right? We talk about what we call the value chain of a product. Right, so you have in the top panel here, you have activities ranked by order in production. Right, so you start by research and development. Then when you got the blueprint for the product, you start component production, you assemble, and then you got to do marketing and sales. Okay, and notice here that some of these production processes, right, some of these stages, some of these tasks can be put in other countries. Why do you want to do that? Well, usually because you want to save cost, right? You want to put, for example, component production in a location where the wages are lower. All right. So what is useful here is to rank these activities based on how much low-skilled labor relative to high-skilled labor is needed. All right. R&D obviously requires a lot of high-skilled labor. All right. Assembly, well, that's easily standardized. It's something that doesn't require a lot of skilled labor. So what we would see in this sort of simple model here is that the tasks that require relatively less high-skilled labors, those are the ones that would be offshored, right? That you would put in a country where the wage rate is lower, so that you can you know, make your production process cheaper. All right. So this is what we mean when we talk about this term, which is called slicing the value chain, right? Which you may have heard. So I would usually do in a class, I would usually introduce this very simple offshoring model. Just say that, suppose you have two activities, right? So to produce a particular good, let's say widgets, all you need is components production and R&D. Okay, each of these activities uses both skilled and unskilled labor, but the components uses relatively more unskilled labor. R&D, of course, uses relatively more skilled labor, right? This is what we mean by skilled labor intensity. All right, and we assume that the cost of capital are equal in both activities. And what we do in this very simple model is that we compare the no trade situation to an equilibrium with trade, where we allow for component production to be put in a country where the wage rate is lower. All right, and then we look at the gains from trade to see if there are gains from trade. All right. So this is something that, you know, might be new to you now. If you've taken any course in economics, this is sort of you know, similar figures to this you've seen 100 times or more. All right. So what we have here is the on the x-axis here, we got the component production, and then we have the R&D right here on the y-axis. This is what we call this is the production possibilities frontier of the firm in the home country. Okay, so we also have in this straight line here, we have the relative price of components. That's the price of components relative to the price of R&D. Okay, and then here we have these isoquants. All right, so an isoquant, for in this case the home firm's isoquant, it represents a quantity of widgets, right? So let's say 1,000 widgets, right? So there are many isoquants. The further out we are here, the larger is the quantity of widgets that is being produced, right? So we want to use our resources, right? We want to use our R&D, our components, and produce as many widgets as possible. So we want to be on the highest possible isoquant that we can reach. All right, that's the problem of the firm, right? So when we say problem, we don't mean it as a negative thing. We say this is the problem that the firm is facing. All right, that is going to solve, right? And then it's constrained by its resources, right? So here by its production possibilities. Okay, so what happens then? Well, when the firm is allowed to put some of its component production abroad, okay, it benefits from that because components can be produced more cheaply abroad than what they can be done at home. All right, so now we have here, this red line here is the world relative price of components, right? Now we're no longer constrained by the domestic price of components relative to R&D. Instead, we're constrained of the world relative price of components. All right, so now what's going to happen is that the domestic firm, this home firm, is going to be producing here at point B. Before it was producing at point A. Now it's producing at point B. So this country produces, compared to point A, now with trade, this home firm, I should say, produces more R&D and less components, right? How does that work? Well, because this particular firm, it exports R&D and it imports the components, right? So this here is the, this here, comparing this point here, right? Here you have the total usage, right, of components, but it is only this part here of the components that are produced at home. The rest of the components, that is what home firm is importing, right? That's produced abroad and they import those components, all right? And then here, right, we have those exports of R&D, right? And you see that by doing this, this allows this firm to produce at a higher isoquant, right? So that means that the firm is now producing more than what it was in autarky, right? When it was in the no trade equilibrium, right? So this it shows the gain from offshoring, the gain from producing the components abroad, from putting the component production abroad. This here, right? This is the gain from trade for this particular firm. All right, so now I just want to sort of quickly wrap up here by showing you, we've sort of looked at a very simple model of offshoring. So I want to sort of just give you a flavor of the kind of global value chain model that we're using in international trade research, right? So there's a Workhorse model, which is called the Eaton Kortum model because of the authors, right? So it builds on this idea that countries have different technology. Some countries have more productive labor, some countries have less productive labor. And it also, geography plays an important role. Trade cost plays an important role, all right? And this actually gives rise to a gravity equation. And there are many, many versions of this Eaton Kortum model, how it has been applying to different kinds of topics, all right? And then, interesting for us today is that there is also a big change sort of in international trade research that came about in 2015, where two other authors extended this model to global value chains, right? So they included input-output linkages across firms, right? They actually used that model to evaluate the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement, but it's a Workhorse model that can be used for many, many other applications, all right? And this, just to sort of give you an idea, right? So there's there is here, right? We have the utility function here, okay? We have many, many sectors, many goods, many sectors. And then we have the input-output linkages, right? So to produce, you need labor and then you need components as well, all right? And, you know, you're buying inputs from all these different industries in all these different countries, right? And then we have this these weights, right? These gammas here, which represent how much of that particular industry, right? And from that particular country is being used in your particular production, all right? And then we assume that there's a distribution of productivity, right? So that's a Frechet distribution, which, once you've taken statistics, you'll sort of think more clearly about this. So I just wanted to highlight that already here. And that's sector specific, right? So here, right, we're taking into account the technology of countries. All right, so countries have different comparative advantage, right? A country with a high productivity is going to have a larger comparative advantage, and the same thing also trade cost matters here as well, right? So if you're located far away from everywhere, it's going to be costly to ship your product from your country to other countries. All right, so this is a big model. Right, and usually when it is applied to all these different topics, we use what we call calibration, right? So we build a model, and then we look at actual trade data, we look at actual production data, and then we apply, right, the model to the data, so that we say, okay, let's build a model of trade the way it looks today. All right, so we look at actual trade shares. So these here are our trade shares, right? This is the exports from country N to country I in industry K, okay? And then you have what is the share of imports, right, in different sectors. And then you have these gammas, right, which is said is, shows how much you're importing from all these different sectors in all these different countries, right? That is fitted to the input-output data that we have available for many countries in the world. Okay, so essentially now what you have is that you have a model that fits the world as it looks, let's say, in 2005. Okay, why does this matter? Well, because we want to ask the question, what if? So for example, the Caliendo and Parro model asked the question, what if there had been no North American Free Trade Agreement? What would the world have looked like then? Right, so we use the model that is calibrated to the actual data in a particular year, all right, or a particular period. And then we say, suppose we change something. Suppose we remove the North American Free Trade Agreement. What would happen to international trade? What would international trade flows look like? Okay, and of course here the trade costs, right, starts to matter as well. All right, so essentially, when it comes to global value chains and COVID-19, of course, the obvious question is, what would, let's say we take a model, we take the trade the way it looked before the pandemic, and this is exactly what one of the papers that we'll talk about in the 2 minutes that I have left. What would the world look like if we would have the COVID-19 pandemic, but we would not have had global value chains? Right? How badly would countries have been hit? Okay, so why do you need these complicated models to ask such a simple question? Well, you need that because not all countries are the same, right? If you look at all these different countries here, they're divided by regions, you see that the foreign intermediate input use varies a lot by countries. So some countries are much more exposed to what happens in other countries than other countries. And the same thing goes for industries, right? Some industries rely much more on foreign intermediate inputs than other industries, okay? So there's this paper that say, okay, let's say we model the pandemic-induced lockdown as a shock to labor supply, all right? And then they have a model, exactly this kind of model that we just looked at, that has input-output linkages, and it models the world with all these input-output linkages, so these sectors and countries are all linked together. And then we look at how shocks are transmitted through these global value chains, right? So they have many sectors, 64 countries, and then they say, let's pretend that we have our model, we build our model, and then we simulate a global lockdown, right? So they simulate this as a contraction of labor supply, right? So they use this data that we've seen before, the fractional work of different occupations that can be done from home, and then also they look at variation across sectors, and they also look at variation across countries, right? So there's lots of variation in terms of what occupations are used in different countries' production, and also there's lots of variation in terms of sectoral employment composition, right? So that's why there's variation across sectors, variation across countries. And this means that each country is having different kinds of labor supply shocks from the pandemic, right? Different shocks in different industries in different countries. Right? And then they also, of course, countries also vary in the stringency of lockdown measures. So again, they're using this familiar data that we've seen other papers use before. Okay, so essentially, they look at this country occupation specific shock. All right, and then they say, well, let's look at a shock of a foreign lockdown to domestic GDP. But let's separate the domestic component of the shock and the foreign component of the shock. Okay, and then we need to think about also there's a big change here in terms of how much does a shock to the domestic economy, right? How much do domestic shock? How much does that matter for the overall impact on a country, right? Because of course, here, as you'll see in a minute or two, what happens here is obviously that when you rely less on, you're less exposed to foreign shocks, but you're more exposed to domestic shocks. All right. And this is, they do this analysis, this counterfactual analysis, say, what if there had been that global supply chains would actually have been nationalized? All right. What would have happened to the economy? And what they find is that the downturn would have been worse. All right. Than the actual downturn that happened, right? So this is because when you eliminate your reliance on foreign inputs, you increase the reliance on domestic inputs. It's very mechanical, right? And, that could sometimes be very bad for countries, all right? And also here, they see that what matters a lot is what happens in other countries, right? So if you have a stricter lockdown than your neighboring countries, well, that's going to have different effects than if you have a lesser lockdown than your neighboring countries, right? But importantly, they find that there's no sector in which renationalization of a supply chain improves resilience, right? Either if you measure it by GDP or by value added of the sector, all right? And there's, of course, other papers that are looking at a similar thing. All right, so let me just, I'm over time, let me just conclude very quickly here. So essentially here, papers have found that COVID-19 shocks, they magnified, right, the global impact of local supply disruptions, right? That's something that is confirmed. But they find that if you would sever global supply chains, it wouldn't make countries more resilient, right, to these kinds of pandemic-style labor supply shocks, because they would be more exposed to domestic shocks. And at the same time, right, welfare losses from this decoupling, right, it's very costly to remove, the global value chains that we have, right, and that cost far exceeds the benefit from any lower shock exposure you could potentially get from severing global value chains. All right. So essentially now the way forward is, well, there is this protectionist trend. This is a political trend that we see, what has been found from economics research is that, well, doing decoupling from global value chains does actually increase vulnerability to domestic shocks, and it is also very costly, right? So this brings us to the plan B that I mentioned earlier on, right? If you don't want to decouple from global value chains, what would you do? Well, at the start of the pandemic, it was clear that many firms did not have a plan B, right? They've been searching for the least cost supplier and they didn't have a plan B. What we were seeing now more and more is the countries will have a plan B in place, right? They will be sourcing from different countries and different firms in different locations and in different sectors, maybe even so, all right? So there's some substitutability there. And also, I think one interesting thing that we don't have time to talk about today is that there's digital trade is becoming much more important, right? So we're seeing digital trade now included in many free trade agreements, or they're even formed as separate free trade agreements. All right, I'm sorry, we are out of time. I'm hoping that I've answered some of your questions. Let me just see, there's a question in the chat here. With the increase in trade barriers, nationalization, current war, and trade groups, how should Singapore position itself to ensure supply and price stability? That's a very good question. I think this depends a bit on the sector, right? So are we talking about, a sector where Singapore is sort of more upstream or more downstream? And also, I think interesting, the obvious example that we've been seeing is what's been happening in the food sector, right? So Singapore has I think, done a quite tremendous job in terms of diversifying food supply since the pandemic, and also increasing domestic production. But price stability is a tough one. I think that's almost nothing you can do about that. I think it's because it's a global issue. It's very difficult to predict that, how to handle that. I'm sorry, I'm over time. Is there? Let's see, there's one more question here. Russia's refusal to supply gas to the EU, where does this fit in the presentation you just gave us here? So what we would have here, right, is that a lot of the production in, for example, Germany, right, relies on Russian gas. There's also the same thing in Poland and Eastern Europe, right? A lot of the European multinational firm production is being done in Eastern Europe, and they're now having this, they in particular having this problem where, you know, they can still buy the gas from Germany, or they can still buy the gas from Russia, but they're not allowed to pay in ruble, right? Okay. So what's been happening here is that there is a lot of change happening in Germany. There's a push in Germany now for a lot of economies have gone together, and they have actually trying to say, well, let's take a hit in GDP. We're going to experience a drop in GDP, but at least we stop buying Russian gas and we start buying from other countries instead, which is going to be a huge structural change for the German industry. I'm sorry, I think I'm so much out of time. I have to pass on to my colleague, Prof. Chow. There is one question left. I hope I'll type an answer to that one instead. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry to have not had more time for your very interesting questions. If there's more questions, please type them in the chat, and I will answer there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for the very interesting presentation, really dealing with such relevant issues. It's my turn now, and so I'm here to give the information session. Please allow me to share screen. Okay. Right. I hope all of you can see the screen. Right. So good afternoon to you all, and again, thank you for attending this session with us. I'm very happy to join you to provide some information on the School of Economics postgraduate professional programs. My name is Hui Kwan, and I'll be very glad to answer your questions if you have any later on. So Ivan has given an excellent introduction of SMU, and School of Economics is one of the 6 schools here. We have about 60 faculty who are actually experts in the various fields of economics. And of course, Amanda, whom you have heard from, is an expert in international trade. So despite being a very young school, we are very glad that we have done well in rankings. In fact, we have been ranked as a leading school for economics research in Asia. So what are the key features of our 2 programs, Masters of Science in Economics and Masters of Science in Financial Economics? Three key features in both these programs. The first is that they are rigorous, so you get an in-depth training in microeconomics, macroeconomics, as well as econometrics framework. So referring to the lecture just now, quite a lot of the models actually involve data. So you do not just study theory, but you also look at empirics to see whether the data supports this theory. Apart from having a good grounding in economics, the other very important feature of our program is that it is very practical. So you will realize that invariably in all courses, even the theory ones, we would bring in applications to what is happening in practice. So our curriculum is very industry relevant. Of course, on top of that, you have the option of doing an internship if you are if you would like to have to do one. Okay. And the third feature of our program is that it's very flexible. we try to cater to varied interests and varied needs of students. So the first form of flexibility we offer is that this program is not just for people who have already gotten an undergraduate degree in economics. Of course, those who have an undergraduate degree in economics can will join us in what we call the accelerated pathway in August. And we also cater to people who do not have a background in economics. And these would join us in something called the regular pathway, where we build up your foundation before hitting the main program. And I'm very happy to say that quite a lot of our students who did very well include those who didn't previously have background in economics. So we do have engineers and others who switched career, who wanted to switch career, and they join us for this training in economics. All right. The other form of flexibility is that we offer both full-time and part-time program for the Masters of Science in Economics. So for those of you who are working full-time and you can only you only want to do this program part-time, you can join the MSE, and we have evening classes on Saturdays, and you will see later on the whole curriculum is spread out so that it's manageable for you. Of course, the other flexibility is about enrolling in the courses in other programs, and this we will talk a bit more later on when we discuss the curriculum. So 3 key features of both programs: rigorous, practical, and flexible. Actually, regardless of which master's program or undergraduate program that you join in SMU, you will benefit from our bespoke interactive pedagogy. SMU is a place where the instructors care a lot about their teaching, because we know that this is one avenue where we can make a good impact on others. And so there's a lot of emphasis on teaching well, and our infrastructure, for example, seminar rooms are such that we can hold up to maybe about 45 people. And so typically a class is less than that. And what happens is, because of that, you get a lot of interaction with your instructors, and you get to also learn from your peers, and you will find that such active learning really helps you to understand and retain the concepts and the skills that you have been learning in the class, right? Okay, of course, very important for all of us would be the career. We do have a dedicated career coach for the program, and basically there will be career preparation and career training in the various workshops that are being offered, and we also organize events for industry networking. Okay. Finally, of course, we also want to have fun. We don't just want to. Of course, growing ourselves is developing ourselves is a very good thing. But we organize exchanges. So we now actually have 3 of our master students in Paris, right? And they're not just in Paris for fun. They're actually doing a certificate program. So the certificate program there basically would be very much linked to industry. Okay, so for example, some over there are doing luxury brand. All right, so it's linked to some luxury brands company, and you have other certificate programs dealing with data management and so on and so forth. Okay, we have another exchange, Marseille, and this is also in France, South France, also very beautiful. And that one, the exchange happens in the January term. We are actually working to have more partnerships with other universities as well. Okay, right. So these are the program highlights. So I thought to save time, I will just organize the information according to the frequently asked questions that come to us. The first is usually our applicants will will be wondering, what is the difference between MSE and MSFE? So in the Masters of Science in Economics, we actually have two tracks, the Applied Economics track, and this is to develop our students for careers as professional economists. Or you may not be a professional economist, you may be in a profession that benefit from sophisticated economics thinking. So we do have journalists who write economics articles and things like that, right? Then we also have another track called the econometrics and quantitative economics track. Now this one is to train our students for careers that require quantitative economics research. So, more rigorous analysis of economic, financial, and social data. So examples would be careers in, say, the Ministry of Finance, where you need to work out the taxes and so on. MTI, Economy Scheme, or MAS. So various government agencies, as well as some other agencies in the bank, where you need to do quantitative kind of research, right? Some of our our master students go on actually to do a PhD in economics. All right, so that will be the MSE. The other program we have is our MSFE, which is the Masters of Science in Financial Economics. And this one is a multidisciplinary program because it has both economics and finance. Okay, and this program prepares our students for careers in the financial industry. All right, whereby they need to do financial data analysis, product development, portfolio management, financial research, insurance, and so on. Okay, so we'll later on show you what are the various sectors which our graduates go into, right, after they have finished the programs with us. So this one on whether one is eligible to apply if the major or the undergraduate degree is not in economics. So this I've actually touched on to say that those without economics as their undergraduate major, you're very welcome. All right, we're prepared for you the foundation courses in the January and April term. So you come in January, and then after doing the foundation courses, which is mainly the principles of economics, math or economics, you go on to do your core courses in the program. Now, of course, when you're doing foundation courses, you might actually opt to do other courses that do not have prerequisites for the core of the core courses. All right. Those, as mentioned, those with already strong economic and quantitative background, you come in August term and start straight away with the core of micro, macro, and econometrics. Okay. All right. What is the course duration for the respective admission pathways? So if you already have economic background and quantitative background, you come in August, you finish a program in 10 months if you do it full time. Okay, those of students who are doing the program part-time, they will take a year more to do so. Okay, so similarly for the regular pathway, the difference between full-time and part-time is an additional year. So the part-time, full-time option is only for the MSE program, both the AE track as well as the EQ track that we talked about just now. For the MSFE, that one is a full-time program only. And very frequently we are asked, is there flexibility in choosing our courses? Yes, it's an emphatic yes. All right, this is our curriculum structure. Of course, foundation is quite standard. Core is also quite standard. For MSFE, you do not just do the core in econs, you have to do core in finance, like empirical finance, corporate finance, and so on. Then the flexibility in terms of choice of courses comes in at the electives basket. You will, if you have time, I'll show you later on. There's a long list of electives that you can choose from. So Amanda's course on trade is one of them. There are things like machine learning, all right? There are also things like data analytics course dealing with spatial economics. So that one is very useful for tracking property prices and things like that, right? We also have, of course, health economics. Very popular is also the behavioral economics elective. So a very wide range of electives offered in the different terms, and you get to choose, according to your interests. We also have things like competition law, where we invite experts. So the person teaching is not necessarily faculty, but it could be. We also invite experts from outside, right? Economists who are who are practitioners or heading some research institutes to come and mount the course which is in their expertise. And these people usually have lots of contact outside, and they can bring in guest speakers to make the course even more interesting and relevant for you. The open basket is the one where you can choose to do an internship or a capstone project. Now, the capstone project provides you with individualized learning, because what happens is you choose a topic of your interest, right? Say something on sustainability, right? And then you discuss with the supervisor to nail down the questions that you want to answer and how you want to go about doing it. So then you will be supervised individually, and at the end you got to submit a paper, right? And so that would be the grade for that paper, as well as all your interim reports will form the grade of that course. So capstone project is very useful for students who are interested in a particular issue, and also it builds a person's research capability, how to collect data, how to analyze data, how to be able to come up with a good report, right? To discuss your findings. So most of the capstone projects are empirical in nature, and quite a number of them are also related to industry. Okay, of course, there are those who don't want to do an internship or capstone project. Then you can just do another course, whether it is from your own set of electives, or you can do from, if you're MSE student, you can do from MSFE selection. You can even assess the courses from other master's program in SMU. Okay, so you actually, a number of our students sit in the classes of another program, and there they also get to meet with other people, right, from other programs, which will help with their network. Now, the last basket is what we call the postgraduate professional development basket, and this one is not the usual course, rather it is a workshop. All right, so you can choose from the various kinds of workshops, whether it's more on career training workshop or negotiation skills and things like that. Okay. Now, so I must say, we have sort of bent backwards to cater to student interest in terms of the amount of flexibility that we are offering. And so what are the admission requirements? So these we would require a good bachelor degree, not necessarily in economics, good scores in either the GMAT, GRE, or the SMU admission test. You don't have to take all three, you just have to take one of them. If your major for undergraduate degree wasn't in English, we would require the results from the English test, 2 referees, personal statement to help us understand your motivation of joining the course and what your objectives are. And of course, finally there's an admission interview to help us assess your fit for the program. Okay, in terms of so these are the fees. Because the regular pathway has 4 more courses, so the fees are slightly higher. And there are some scholarships on offer. So what happens is you don't have to apply separately to the scholarship. When we go through the admissions application, we would already be seeding out those who are eligible for the scholarships. Okay. Okay, so here is the graduate profile by industry, which I mentioned that we will show you. So for MSE, the Masters of Science in Economics, the bulk, 1/4 of our students end up in financial services, and then quite evenly spread, 17% between technology, government, and media. These are lumped together. And of course, consulting is also quite a big group. All right. Okay, then for the MSFE, obviously we will have more, 45% in the financial services industry, but not insignificant numbers in the other industry, the other sectors. Okay, right. So this is the application deadline for our August intake would be end of this month, whereas for the January intake, the deadline is 30th of September. Okay, I think some of you might want to have a special consultation session one-on-one to find out more or to assess whether your is suitable for you to come to the program at this point in time and things like that. We do have such consultation sessions to help you out, right? And this is it. All right. So I have sort of gone a bit fast. I hope you don't mind. And yeah, feel free to ask me any questions if you have any. Right. I'll look at the chat box now. Okay, I think more or less we covered everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Chow, and thank you,
you're
Prof.
welcome.
Amanda, for your time and for your valuable sharing today. We hope you've enjoyed today's session and will now invite you to participate in our feedback poll. Please give us your honest feedback so that we can further improve on our brown bag series. The feedback poll should be popping up on your screen, so please take a few moments to share with us your observations. Just take a few moments as the responses are coming in. Really appreciate you taking time to do this. Thank you very much for your feedback and for joining us today. This Brown Bag series is proudly brought to you by HeadHunt in partnership with School of Economics, SMU. We invite you to join us on our next session on 17th of May on the topic of Work and Life in Balance by Singapore University of Social Sciences. Do sign up early on our website, masterclass.sg. With that, we will wrap up today's session. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you on the 17th. Bye.